Hey, it's Coach Anderson here again from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to talk about the railroads in Unit 3 and how the railroads, of course, impact industrialization of the United States of America and settlement of the United States of America. We're talking about the period from 1865, right after the Civil War, of course, into 1901. So with that, we'll do what we always tell you. If you have a journal, go ahead and take out your journal, and at this particular time, write down any of the focus questions or any of the vocabulary that you may need, and you can refer back to it, of course, before you take your next map assessment. All right, today we're going to start with our unit focus question like we always do. Once again, we won't answer it, but we will go back and address it, of course, at the end of the chapter. The question is, how did the United States become an industrialized society after the Civil War? And our do now activity for today, the journal topic, what does it mean to become an investor in a business? In this particular time, what we'll do, of course, give you a few minutes to formulate an answer, and we'll come back and ask you what you think in just a few seconds, and we'll give you an idea of what we think. Okay, you should have had enough time, of course, that you were able to go through and look at what is the question in terms of what does it mean, of course, to become an investor. An investor is a person, of course, that takes his own resources and basically gives it to someone else to use, of course, to create a business or to create a opportunity or a venture, of course, that will bring him a return, meaning this here. So you're an investor, of course, when you take your own resources or your own money, of course, and you give it to someone else so that they could take it and turn it into a business venture, of course, that'd be profitable for you, where you would get a dividend or return on your investment. So if you were living in the late 1800s, the early 1900s in the United States of America, we're going to find that a lot of businesses are going to benefit from investment with the creation of the corporation that'll start a little bit later. The vocabulary that we have for today, of course, is going to be words like integrate and land grant. We'll get to those as we go and as we see them. Of course, we'll try to identify them and give you some explanations of what they are. But if we don't, look them up yourself, and you'll be able, of course, to fill any gaps that we miss. Lesson focus questions. How did the Transcontinental Railroad transform the West? And number two, how did the government grants to build railroads result in large-scale corruption? We'll start by talking about linking the nation. In 1865, the United States had about 35,000 miles of track, a railroad track. By 1900, it had over 200,000 miles of railroad track. One of the things that President Lincoln, of course, recognized is that, with the fighting of the Civil War, one of the things was that the need, of course, to link both of the coasts. And remember now, this country, of course, was built on the idea of manifest destiny, which means that it should stretch from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. And this was just the next step. All right, the Transcontinental Railroad started with the passage of the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, of course, by Lincoln. The nation would be linked from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, Greenville Dodge from the east, and the Central Pacific Railroad, Theodore Judah from the west. On May 10th, 1869, the United States of America coasts were linked with the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads met at Promontory Point, Utah. Here you see a picture, of course, and when those two railroads, of course, or two rail lines, of course, were joined, and the golden spike, of course, was set, and you see, of course, members from the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific side or shaking hands. On the left, you have Greenville Dodge, a Union Pacific Railroad, of course, that came from the East Coast. And then on the right, you have the Central Pacific Railroad with Theodore Judah. The big four from the Central Pacific, that from the West Coast coming to the east. You had Leland Stanford on the left. Same guy, of course, from Stanford University, that endowed Stanford University. On the right, you have Charlie Crocker. You have Mark Hopkins, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure Mark Hopkins, his endowment, of course, led to the creation of Johns Hopkins. You can go back and check that, of course, for me, and let me know what you find out. Collis P. Huntington, of course, and these made up the big four people, of course, that created the Central Pacific side of the Transcontinental Railroad. Railroads spur growth. Well, you have to understand something. Because of the creation of industry, of course, on the East Coast, how do you see about taking and spreading those particular products, of course, to the West Coast, and also open them up so that you can take them to the West Coast port cities like San Francisco, of course, and send them to Asia? Well, one of the things that happened is because of railroad spurring growth, we're going to find not only will the Transcontinental Railroad will be built, but we're going to have intersecting or integrating lines, of course, that will run in and out of course, the Transcontinental Railroad hubs. The railroads helped close the frontier because of the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad, more and more, of course, settlers and Asian immigrants, and then, of course, European immigrants could enter and get on the Transcontinental Railroad, of course, and make their way, of course, to the West, which means that very simply, the West is going to be settled a whole lot quicker because it's a whole lot easier, of course, to get from eastern cities to to the interior of the country and get from the western cities to the interior of the country. It used to take about 6 months by wagon, of course, to go from from the East Coast city, of course, to the West Coast. Now it takes about 5 to 6 days. The robber barons. The construction of the railroad was big business, with the government providing tons of assets and money for rail construction. Sometimes, of course, people took advantage of that money that the government was giving, and it ended up, of course, leading to a lot of corruption. Those people, like Jay Gould, are going to be called robber barons, and they were called robber barons because in most cases, they took advantage of people, of course, to make great fortunes. They include some of the people that you see here: Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, Gould, Vanderbilt, and Duke. Now, they all came back a little bit later, of course, and were recognized as captains of industry in most cases because they did certain things, of course, to make or improve society for Americans. Here you see a picture of Jay Gould. Jay Gould. He was one of those robber barons. He wasn't as nice as some of the others, and he was one of those that would probably knock over his mother, of course, to make a buck if he saw a dollar, of course, on the ground. And one of the statements that he was famous for having said is, "Use what you can, when you can, to get what you can." And that was a statement that characterizes his outlook on life. One of the biggest scandals, of course, of corruption had happened in 1872 was the Credit Mobilier scandal. And what it basically had involved, of course, was rich men, of course, robber barons, of course, who were taking advantage of government money. In this particular case, government subsidies, of course, for land subsidies, in which they took that money, of course, and then didn't build railroads. But what they did is they took it, of course, and took the land to build railroads. But what they ended up doing, of course, is settling it to people and leaving the railroad, of course, unbuilt. And one of the most notorious at it was a robber baron by the name of Oaks Ames. All right, now, just as there were people, of course, that used their positions, of course, to make money for themselves, you had some, of course, that did things the right way. The founder and the creator of the Great Northern Railroad, which was one of those very few railroads that did not go bankrupt, was James J. Hill. And no one would ever accuse him, of course, as being a robber baron, because he used his money in most cases, of course, to the betterment of the people, of course, that worked for him. All right, that leads us to the lesson focus questions in terms of what it is about this particular lesson we want you to kind of focus on and get an idea about. This is, how did the Transcontinental Railroad transform the West? Well, very simply. The railroad brought towns, economic growth, population increases, and allowed territories to apply for statehood. The most significant impact was it closes the western frontier. The next lesson focus question that we had is how did the government grants to build railroads result in large-scale corruption? Well, because there was so much money involved and there wasn't a way, of course, to watch what people were doing, people made a lot of money. It says, how did the government grants to build railroads result in large-scale corruption? The size of the projects and the money involved tempted some politicians to accept bribes, and investors figured out that they could make huge fortunes just by gaining title to public land and selling to settlers and others. Remember what we said about Oaks Ames. He was one of those politicians, of course, that used his position to get those land grants or land subsidies, of course, from railroad companies, and he sold it to his friends, who in turn turned around and sold it, of course, to other people, and he got what we would call a kickback from it. In other words, it was kind of quid pro quo. He did for them, and they did for him. Here are a couple of practice questions that you might want to be aware of course, when the map test, of course, is given. It says, how did railroads most impact farming in the West during the late 1800s? A, they connected farms with distant markets to sell their harvest. B, they helped large landowners illegally acquire land from homesteaders. C, the greater ease of transportation led many farmers to change to cattle ranching. D, they made owning large farms more difficult by laying tracks through farmlands. Well, the best answer would probably be A, they connected farms, of course, with distant markets to sell their harvest. So if you were farming in the Great Plains region, you could take your harvest, of course, and send them to the East Coast where America's big cities were. Last practice questions. Which statement best describes how the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad contributed to the closing of the American frontier? A, markets of Asia were open to American products. The coast of America were connected by industry. C, the landscapes of the West were protected from commercial development. D, the resources of the East were used to develop Midwestern cities. And the answer would be the coast of America were connected by industry. Last of the practice questions. Powerful industrialists like Carnegie, Rockefeller were called robber barons and captains of industry because A, they provided good paying jobs to produce unsafe products. C, they provided new goods and services while underpaying their laborers. C, they supported workplace reform but drove their competitors out of business. D, they worked closely with their competitors and charged incredibly high rates. The answer very simply is B. They did create new products and services, but they didn't necessarily look after their employees. Remember that we said that one of the only ones that did that was James J. Hill from the Great Northern Railroad, who made sure that he gave America a good product, but he also took care of his workers. That takes us to the end of lesson 3. And remember what we said, don't take my word for it. Go ahead and do your own research and then make up your own mind in terms of what you see. Remember, it's America's history, which means it's your history. So do what you can, of course, to investigate on your own. And until next time, we'll see you then.